Hello, welcome to JFO Aviation and this presentation on the new MOSAIC final rule. This ruling has been in the works for many years, and it is something that a lot of people in the industry are excited about and have been for some time. This rule is unique. The FAA says it's one of, if not the first rule that they have instituted, certainly one of the most significant that started externally, that came from the industry or from a third party outside the FAA. And a lot of people, again, are very thrilled and very excited about this ruling. So it's been in the works for some time, and there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to use this time really to go over the pilot side of MOSAIC. There's a lot to do with aircraft certification and with light sport repairments and stuff like that. And while we will touch some of those things as they are relevant to pilots, most of what we are going to focus on is, again, the pilot side and how not only sport pilots but also certified pilots should see and interact with this ruling. So come along, let's hop in and get started. First, a little bit about me. I'm an active full-time flight instructor, CFIIIMEI. A little bit over 1,100 hours of dual given, and about the same amount of time in sport and sport-compliant aircraft. So it's roughly the same amount of time. It's not a direct one-to-one comparison. I do have dual given and standard category aircraft. I have time in light sports that are not dual. But generally speaking, my first company that I was with as an instructor specialized in light sport flying and light sport aviation. So quite a bit of time in the sport world and sport aircraft and in close quarters with sport pilots. So I can tell you they're all excited about this, as am I. So what we're going to start with is what exactly MOSAIC is. The most notable aspect of this ruling, and what most people have been focusing on, is that there is a significant increase in the privileges that sport pilots have. Every time you see a big kind of chunky text like this, uncited in quotes, that's language that comes straight from the FAA. So this is a direct quote that I just pulled out of that final rule. So it expands what aircraft sport pilots may operate. It also amends some of the operating rules for restricted category aircraft, some of the limitations on experimental aircraft, as well as experimental aircraft as they relate to space support vehicles. Excuse me. So again, we're going to spend most of our time on the pilot side, and we'll touch on certifications as they are necessary. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the legacy light sport. That's the light sport that's currently in effect. MOSAIC goes into effect, I believe it's October 22nd. So this legacy light sport is in effect for about 3 more months, roughly. Just under 3 months, 2.5. What we're going to look at are the limitations that are currently on the sport world. First of all, you don't quite get every single type of aircraft into the sport world. Notably, rotorcraft helicopter is missing from the list of aircraft that may be under the sport category. That's been the case since 2004, when sport aviation was first released. So right now we have airplanes, gliders, powered parachutes, weight shift control, and gyroplanes as acceptable sport aircraft. There is currently a 1,320-pound max takeoff weight that increases by 110 for aircraft designed for use on water to allow for the extra weight that floats bring. Max VS1 of 45 knots calibrated, max VH speed of 120, fixed gear only, fixed pitch propellers only. Equally, there are some limitations on what pilots may do. Only 2 seats under the current rule. That allows for the pilot and 1 passenger. Day VFR only under the current rule. Pilots are also restricted to flight below 10,000 MSL or 2,000 AGL, whichever is higher. So 10,000 feet above sea level or 2,000 feet above the ground. Currently, Class Bravo Charlie Delta airspaces require an endorsement. No Class Alpha ever, since that's designated specifically for instrument flight rules. Permission to fly in other countries, MOSAIC can't change that, and no carrying passengers or property for hire or flying in furtherance of a business. Some of these restrictions are going to stay in place. Light sport pilots can still not fly in furtherance of a business. No Class Alpha ever. You're still going to need an endorsement into Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. The altitude restriction has not changed. What has changed is the number of seats allowed on a plane flown by a sport pilot. You now get 4. You're still only limited to yourself plus 1 passenger. You also get the option to fly at night, again, only under visual flight rules. We'll take another peek at the aircraft limitations. The changes to aircraft are a little bit more distinct. They're a little bit more notable. And we're going to get into details on all of these, but rotorcraft helicopter will be allowed under the new sport MOSAIC rule. The max takeoff weight is gone. The max V1 speed is higher. The max VH speed is higher. And we are introducing retractable and constant speed propellers to the sport world. So again, we'll get into details about all of that. But that's a little bit of an overview as to what the sport world is currently like and a general idea of what is changing. So what's included in the new rule? This is the bulk of what we're going to be discussing today. First of all, upgraded aircraft performance. Just mentioned this a moment ago. We get 4-seat airplanes for sport pilots. Now you still only get 1 passenger. Again, no limitations on aircraft category, which opens up rotorcraft helicopter to light sport category. Important distinction since rotorcraft gyroplane is already allowed. No maximum takeoff weight. That is a big change. Instead, we're shifting from a weight-based standard to a performance-based standard. So your new stall speed, your maximum stalling speed is now going to be 61 for airplanes. Still going to be 45 for gliders and weight shift control. VH is now up to 250 knots. And again, retractable gear and constant speed propellers are permitted with additional training. Equally, no restriction on type or number of engines. We'll get into what that means. Equally, again, night VFR is going to be permissible for sport pilots with the note that even as a sport pilot, you are going to need a valid FAA medical or basic med to operate at night. Now, what does this all mean? That means that a small section of the standard category world is now open to sport pilots. Well, I won't say every, I'm sure someone can find an exception to this, but pretty much across the board, the Cessna 150 and 152 are now sport eligible. The 172 can be flown by a sport pilot. Certain members of the PA-28 family, or more basic Cherokees and Warriors and whatnot, as well as some Cessna 182 Skylanes, are now all allowable under the sport rules. So it's a pretty significant jump for a sport pilot that's been used to, a 162 Skycatcher or a Pipistrel Alpha or, the Vashon Ranger or whatever you may be flying, to be able to get all the way up to a 182. But again, people are excited, so it's a big change, and I think a lot of people will enjoy the additional authority. This slide, really, I should have put a couple later. I'm gonna skip ahead. I'll come back to it in a second. Again, as we mentioned earlier, 172, 150, 52, 182, some Cherokees and Warriors who can fly with only sport license still don't need a medical for day VFR. Just a driver's license is fine. Um, medical will be required for night flight. That night privilege, of course, comes with some additional training. Um, so night privileges requires a 3 hours of training, as well as a certain dual cross country and some takeoffs and landings at night with an instructor. Endorsements are required for retractable landing gear and for manual controllable pitch propeller. Those are distinct endorsements. Private, commercial, airline transport pilots will be familiar, for example, with the complex endorsement. That is notably distinct from these endorsements that the FAA has outlined. We'll get into that later. And again, sport pilots are limited to only one passenger, even when they have 4 seats. Now, in some terms, the FAA is going to say that there's really no such thing as a light sport aircraft anymore. This is an important note to make, and we have a distinction that we have to clarify, at least for the purpose of this video. What the FAA really means by saying that they're removing the term light sport aircraft from their lexicon is that they can't really say that sport pilots can only fly sport aircraft, because that is no longer the case. Again, we saw a number of standard category aircraft are open to sport pilots now. However, the FAA is not doing away with the light sport category of aircraft airworthiness. There's still going to be such thing as an aircraft approved as a light sport aircraft specifically. So again, you're doing away with the performance-based requirements. You're doing away with, or actually with the weight-based requirements, and you're reverting it only to a performance-based requirement. So instead of saying, hey, your airplane has to weigh no more than 1,320 pounds, they're just going to double check, for example, among other things, that the aircraft's stall speed is 61 knots or less. We're going to go back a couple. When the FAA is looking at approving these light sport aircraft, really the distinction between what will continue to be an airplane or an aircraft certified under light sport versus standard is that there are certain rules and regulations that don't necessarily apply to the light sport world. And there are some that are changed and that are different. The easiest example is that as it stands now, light sport aircraft are not required to comply with 91205. And as such, in the new MOSAIC rule, that is going to continue. At a minimum, airplanes and aircraft certified under the light sport rules must have the instrumentation necessary for safe flight and all kinds of operation for which it is authorized. Now, that second bullet point, you're going to notice something interesting. There is a case where a light sport aircraft certified after middle of 2026 can fly into instrument meteorological conditions. So what will happen is that we very well may end up seeing a pretty wide disparity between one light sport and another. Something from a very basic, simple airframe with wings that's just literally the very basic you need, all the way up to something that is a full-on capable IMC machine that just happens to stall at less than 61 knots. And again, that would open up the world for something similar to like a 172 to be certified under light sport rules, as long as the proper documentation is there. Of course, the second you are getting into IMC, you have to comply with 91205, but there will be steps that manufacturers building light sport airplanes will need to take to get there. So I'll jump ahead. Just mentioning this, what it means for an aircraft to be certified in the light sport category. Again, we're not going on weight anymore. We're going on performance. Aircraft in the light sport category will retain many of the same limitations, again, with exceptions. So no carrying passengers for hire. And they're going to have many of the same things. A lot of the time people see this even now as a benefit. For example, that conditional inspection. as opposed to, again, a standard category aircraft like a 172 or 182 that needs an annual signed off every year by an A&P, 100 hours at a flight school. We're just getting conditional inspections in the sport world. These can be done by an A&P, they can be done by a light sport repairman. The threshold is a little bit lower, which often reduces the cost of those inspections, which helps with the overall affordability of a light sport aircraft. And again, with certain statements of compliance and markings in the pilot operating handbook, some restrictions can be lifted. So, for example, if the manufacturer marks on the POH the plane can be an IMC and they said the FAA statement of compliance, that light sport aircraft might just be approved into instrument conditions. Of course, that won't be applicable to sport pilots who can't be an IMC, but it will be applicable to higher levels of certificates that choose to use sport aircraft as a method to, for example, build instrument time. Something else that is changing is the number and type of engines. Light sports are currently only restricted to one singular reciprocating engine. That's going to change. There is no limit anymore under MOSAIC. For the number of engines an aircraft can have, there will be no limit either as to the type of engine. The FAA got a lot of comments on this that they mentioned in the final rule from companies that wanted to be able to innovate in the light sport space and wanted to use light sport aircraft as a way to test, for example, electrical engines, to be able to test battery cells. So having the ability to test something new and go into a new world is going to give more opportunity for, again, testing electrical engines or hydrogen engines out in the real world to see how they hold up on a regular scale. As a slight sidebar, one other thing that has changed because of this is how powered lift aircraft see themselves in the right-of-way rules. Powered lift is now going to be on the same plane as airplane and rotorcraft, pardon the pun, when it comes to right-of-way rules, regardless of the phase of flight. So powered lift is now giving way to, for example, gliders, balloons, and airships, as well as any powered aircraft towing an ultralight or a glider. Seating limitations. We mentioned this a couple times, but it's an important thing, and it's, again, people have been excited about. Two-seat limitation continues in gliders, balloons, airships, powered parachutes, and weight shift control due to weight and balance issues. Some commenters did want the FAA to increase for gliders and rotorcraft and gyroplanes especially, which will also retain the 2cm limit. Those three people were interested in adding a third. The FAA said no purely out of weight and balance concerns. So they wanted to keep those at 2. Now, the airplane world, I didn't explicit, actually, yeah, I did that second line in the second paragraph. Airplanes can now be certified with 4 seats. The FAA noted that they kind of implied that they would prefer 4-seat aircraft to be stuck in the primary category, but they did still allow aircraft or airplanes certified under the sport category to be produced with up to 4 seats. Now, that does not mean that all 4 seats may be used. You still only get pilot plus 1 passenger, but it does open up the world again to sport pilots to aircraft that are a little bigger, a little more powerful, better performance, a little heftier. Aerial work. I heard a lot of back and forth about this in the lead up to MOSAIC, and we finally got some clarity. So, sports pilots were pushing for a while to be able to essentially fly for hire in certain capacities. So doing things like aerial application, crop dusting, banner towing is on there, pipeline patrol. Sport pilots are not going to be allowed to do that under MOSAIC. And I think it's the next slide, maybe somewhere. There it is. MOSAIC, the FAA was very clear about this. MOSAIC does not alter pilot certification requirements. So when we look at what MOSAIC includes for the aerial application world, they're not saying that sport pilots can charge for their services. What they're saying is that sport aircraft are allowed in certain cases to be used by commercial pilots for certain specified aerial application needs or aerial work needs. So they specifically said that the first bullet point in the left column there defines what aerial work means for this part. It's work done from the air with the same departure and destination points, no property belonging to another carried on the aircraft, and only persons essential to the operation can be carried. So the FAA uses the Part 119 exemptions as a non-exhaustive list for what this aerial work includes. Again, aerial applications such as crop dusting, seeding, spraying, bird chasing, banner towing, aerial photography or survey, firefighting, construction repair work, and power line pipeline patrol. Notably, air tours are excluded from that list, as if we go back to that definition, only persons essential to the operation carried. So the FAA is going to argue that a passenger being taken on a tour is not essential to that air tour happening. Certain light sports, again, if they meet specific regulatory approval, the aerial work will need to be approved in the POH, and the FAA is going to need to see a statement of compliance from the manufacturer before anyone can get in a light sport aircraft and use it for aerial work. Starting mid-July, and someone can cite me on that date if I got it wrong, but the date in the final rule said 365 days from publication, which was July 18th of this year, so I just used July 18th of next year as the placeholder. Anything certified in the light sport category after July 18th roughly of 2026 may be eligible to conduct aerial work regardless of class, as long as those aforementioned restrictions are met with, as long as there is a marking in the POH with the applicable operating limitations, and as long as the FAA has a statement of compliance from the manufacturer. A couple other things, statement of compliance required to do aerial work in light sport, which we mentioned. And again, a pilot must still have the appropriate privileges to conduct aerial work for compensation or hire in light sport aircraft. Also, I clumped together in this that experimental aircraft which are not allowed to do aerial work even under MOSAIC are going to have a little bit easier time in some situations. That that last big bullet point and its subpoint, both of those are direct quotes from the final ruling. So allows aircraft with experimental airworthiness certificates to, quote, conduct operations over densely populated areas and congested airways or both for all phases of flight, including but not limited to takeoffs and landings. That's from the FAA. Now, that second sub-point there with the bolded text, the general prohibition against experimental aircraft operating over densely populated areas or in congested airways continues to apply to all experimental aircraft that do not hold appropriate operating limitations issued by the administrator. So essentially what the FAA is doing here is it's reserving itself the right to limit certain experimental aircrafts to the original, the current rule, the pre-MOSAIC rule of no phases of flight over congested areas, but then giving manufacturers the ability to get extra approval to put their airplanes in those situations. Night flight. This is a big change. Sport pilots can now get an endorsement to fly at night. The night endorsement requirement is almost a carbon copy of the private pilot requirement. The only change is to allow for the sport pilot 25 nautical mile cross country as opposed to the private pilot cross country, which has to be 50. So a sport pilot, for their endorsement, would need 3 hours of night flight with an authorized instructor, including one cross-country flight where the destination is at least 25 nautical miles straight line distance away from the origin, as well as 10 takeoffs and landings. Now, I was a little foggy on that second main bullet point. If someone can clarify it down in the comments, I'd appreciate it. The FAA, I believe, has said that once you get a night endorsement, it is not specific to category and class. So if you already hold a sport endorsement for airplane single engine land, for example, and then you go off and get rotorcraft helicopter, my understanding is that you do not need an additional night endorsement specifically for helicopters, even though the FAA acknowledges that in the normal kind of non-sport world with private and commercial, there is a distinction between airplane nighttime and rotorcraft nighttime in the training world. That nighttime is going to be governed for sport pilots, is going to be governed under 61.329 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, and they can count towards the 15-hour minimum toward the sport pilot check ride. So 3 hours of nighttime of night training with that cross country and the 10 landings could, in theory, mean you only need 12 hours of daytime training toward your sport check ride. Now, this last bullet point was controversial in the comments that the FAA got. The FAA is requiring either a third-class medical or basic med to fly VFR at night for sport pilots. A lot of pilots were not thrilled about that. I think there were some quotes in there and that final rule that says, it's kind of an added burden for sport pilots. The FAA doesn't really agree with that. The FAA says that if you want to be flying at night, they want to test your vision to make sure that they have the depth perception that you need to safely fly at night. So it doesn't seem like that medical requirement is going to be going away anytime soon. Yeah, it seems like the FAA is kind of sticking to that, but they are still giving the opportunity of flying at night, which is, I think for many people, which is still a step forward. Now, the FAA is also introducing it's not really a category of aircraft in the terms of, certification and how the FAA certifies, but they are introducing a new realm of aircraft. I think is the best way to say it without kind of getting into terms that the FAA already uses for other things. Aircraft with simplified controls. The FAA doesn't define this. There's no definition as to what an aircraft with simplified controls means, and for that reason specifically, the FAA says that they, though they wanted to, could not issue a blanket endorsement to give for pilots that wanted to operate an aircraft with simplified controls. Instead, what will happen is that pilots who want to fly an aircraft with simplified controls will need an endorsement proving training in a specific make and model. The FAA says that the reasoning behind this is that there is such a wide variety in the types of controls that an aircraft can use, and such a variety in the ways that controls can be simplified, that they didn't think that they could really have a hard and fast definition. Thus, you just need training in each specific method of simplifying controls or each specific model of airplane that has them. Now, in many ways, sometimes sport pilots don't want to go further. That's fine. I've had students that use sport aviation as a stepping stone into private instrument, commercial, even professional aviation. And oftentimes, those flight hours that you get under the sport rules count toward future aeronautical experience as well. That is not the case for aircraft with simplified controls. If you are flying such an airplane, the FAA says that you cannot count any of that flight time and that aircraft with simplified controls toward the aeronautical experience requirements for private, instrument, commercial, or airline transport pilot rules, with the only exception being private pilot applicants testing in aircraft that have simplified controls. So this can mean any number of things. I would speculate to say that this may open up a realm of instructors in the industry that specifically specialize in particular aircraft with simplified controls or particular models of aircraft with simplified controls. Not only because of a rule that we'll get to in a moment, but also just because I think many of the people that are building time toward, for example, an airline transport certificate would not necessarily want to meddle in the realm of something that would not count toward that. So I think you would see more people that are either past the aeronautical experience requirement for airline transport, which would mean professional flight instructors that don't care about it, or airline transport pilots that are, continuing instructing on the side or something of the nature. Now, as let's see, I think I mentioned on the previous slide. As with pilots, instructors will also need that specific training before they can teach in an aircraft with simplified controls. And as with the second slide, which clarifies the same exact requirement for designated pilot examiners, the FAA does acknowledge in that final rule that there will probably be a little bit of a bottleneck, where initially, when a model of aircraft with simplified controls is announced or released, the only people who will be able to give those sign-offs will be factory instructors, which means that pilots and instructors would have to go to the manufacturer together. The FAA also says that as an aircraft has more time on the market and there are more opportunities for more people to fly those aircraft, thus more instructors get the sign-off and there is more and more opportunity over time. Same thing with examiners, which would equally need an endorsement in the aircraft specifically before they can give check rides with that set of simplified controls. There's also, on the flip side, we talked about simplified aircraft. Now let's talk about more complex aircraft. Aircraft with retractable landing gear and with constant speed propellers are now fair game in the sport world. So sport aircraft can be certified with either or both. Sport pilots can operate with either or both. As opposed to, again, the complex endorsement that the industry is widely familiar with, which allows for operation in an aircraft that has retractable gear, constant speed props, and flaps, movable flaps, all three. The sport requirement separates the two new allowances. So their retractable gear endorsement is separate from the constant speed propeller endorsement. And specifically, that final rule mentions that a complex endorsement earned by a private pilot or higher does not eliminate the pilot's needs to seek additional training to operate retractable gear and constant speed propellers under sport pilot privileges. If you have the complex endorsement and you are using private pilot or higher, you're fine. If you dip down to sport, now you need additional training. Additional training is now also needed for the first time since 2007 to operate aircraft designed for water operations that also have retractable landing gear. That is reversing a policy that the FAA has held for 18 years. So I would love, if you are already in that world, I would love to hear your opinions about that and how you're reacting to that new rule down in the comments. New helicopter privileges are also introduced. I'm not going to get into every single requirement here, every training requirement, but here are the requirements that you need to earn a rotorcraft helicopter sport privilege. That training outline, the number of hours you need, is almost exactly what sport airplane pilots need. The total time requirement is higher, we're at 30 instead of 20, but otherwise those are very similar. The cross-country length is a little bit higher for airplanes as well, but otherwise it's quite similar. You'll see the table on the right, again, that is directly from the FAA's new final rule PDF. So you'll be able to find more details on that in the final ruling if you are so inclined. Now, something that again sport pilots may not be thrilled about. The sport world has gotten very used to what's known as a proficiency check. If you already hold sport or higher privileges in anything, and you want to add specifically sport pilot privileges in a new category class, all you need is to get some training, get an endorsement from an authorized instructor, and then get a proficiency check from a different authorized instructor. I've heard of commercial airplane pilots go through that process to get sport glider and sport glider instructor. Now, the FAA now says if you hold any rating and you want to add sport privileges in airplane single engine land, airplane single engine sea, or rotorcraft helicopter, any one of the three, you now need a practical test. You need a check ride. They wanted to also include a knowledge exam, but were persuaded against it by the comments left by the general public. Now, this does not apply if you're adding sport privileges and anything else. So if you're adding sport glider, if you're adding sport rotorcraft gyroplane, sport weight shift control, anything like that, an endorsement plus proficiency check is still just fine with the FAA. You only need check ride if you are adding sport privileges in airplane single engine land, single engine sea, or rotorcraft helicopter. And the FAA says that those three have distinct enough operating characteristics that they want you to be in front of an examiner, a designated pilot examiner, to get your ratings. Now, some people did ask if, why don't we just have DPEs do all proficiency checks for everything? And the FAA kind of said, well, if you do that, then you're kind of, there's becomes no real difference between a proficiency check and a check ride. So to keep clear that those things are distinct, they are saying some categories and classes are proficiency check with CFI, some are practical tests with designated pilot examiner. Now, training requirements to be a sport pilot or instructor. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time into the nitty-gritty. There's a whole set of regulations on what you need to do, what you need to be trained in, and I'm happy in the comments to discuss further, but I'll give a rough idea of what we're working with. For the sport airplane world, 20 hours of total time, including that list below the first bullet point of specific aeronautical experience. This is for cross-country flight training, for takeoffs and landings, for solo time, for preparation for a practical test. Again, that night training that we discussed earlier can be credited towards that total time, toward that 20 hours, if you would like it to. This table again comes from the final rule that the FAA published about 10 or 12 days ago. So if you're more interested about your specific situation or you want a recap of things we've already mentioned, feel free to pause this screen quickly and take a look. But we'll move on. Sport training to further certificates, again, we mentioned this. Anything besides an aircraft with simplified controls, you can credit the time toward future certificates. So, again, one of my students at my first job teaching in life sports is doing exactly that. He's making a career change. He got his sport first. He's flying around his own sport plane that he bought, to build time to become a sport instructor, and then eventually private instrument commercial with the hopes of going all the way to the airlines. Sport instructor, at least for airplane training, and this I guess should say aeronautical experience requirements. 150 hours total, 100 hours as PIC, 50 hours in airplane single engine, and 25 cross country, of which 10 must be in airplane single engine. Your 100 hours as PIC in a powered aircraft must have at least 15 as pilot in command in an airplane single engine designated as a light sport. Sport instructor privileges limitations. Essentially, this, sport instructors are allowed to instruct sport pilots and student pilots pursuing sport. So this will include not only the aeronautical experience for sport pilots, but you can give sport pilots a night endorsement. You can give retractable gear, constant speed, simplified controls, assuming you hold the proper endorsements to be doing it yourself. A caveat that I told my sports students, there is a wide range, if you haven't picked it up already, there's a wide range in the capabilities and performance and limitations of many sport aircraft. Some are pretty simple, right? The aircraft I did my tail wheel endorsement in is a 1946 PA-11 Cub Special. That panel has not changed since it was built in 1946. Very simple, very basic. Compare that with the Pipistrel Alpha that I was teaching in. If MOSAIC had come out 10 years earlier, they would have been flying an IMC long ago. Like full glass Garmin avionics. The new ones have the advanced Garmin autopilots, GPSs, a G3X, multiple G. I mean, they're just glass IFR machines through and through if they were allowed to be an IMC. So the more complex your airplane, the more time it takes. The same is true when I tell private students. I had a guy buy like a high performance turbocharged 182 with vortex generators. The more there is to manage, the more you're going to have to learn. So my sports students in the same airplane were roughly similar to my private students in terms of total time. Now, the comparison was like 50 to 70-ish range for sport and like 60 to 80 for private. So a little bit of a benefit, not huge, but a little bit, to account for the fact that I didn't need to take my sports students to towered airports. We didn't need to go at night. If you're introducing those, if you're based at a towered airport, that's going to add time. If you're doing night, that's going to add time. But when you look at the requirements, private and sport, the maneuvers are almost identical. In fact, I think they are identical. The only thing that I don't need to train, besides night and towers, the only other thing I don't need to train actually, that's not even true, because my students did need to do flight by reference to the instruments because the plane was fast enough. It's not on the check ride, but we had to do it. So be aware, don't expect, I would say, to get into a 182 from 0 time and be done in 20 hours. If your instructor is doing right by you, their goal is to make you a proficient pilot that can handle your airplane. So just be ready to account for external factors as well as adding in variation for your own natural pilot ability. Practically speaking, training doesn't always look exactly like the FAA outlines the minimums. And keep in mind again, the numbers we've seen so far are exactly that, they're minimums. So what does this all mean? This means a few things. One, expanded privileges for sport pilots. Again, that's what I've heard people most excited about. Hey, I really want to get on the Skyline. I really want to get on the 172. And most of the time, it's not that sport pilots want to be flying them consistently. They just want to have the experience of being able to fly them in the first place, right? The FAA says that sport pilots are uniquely safe, uniquely low accident rate, which is why they were comfortable giving these expanded privileges. Um, Equally, that last bullet point I included on the sport pilot page, but it does apply. Commercial pilots can also use airplanes certified under the sport category and in a limited selection of commercial operations, provided compliance with FAA rules and regulations. Benefit of that, as we get onto the next slide, is really cost. A lot of the time you see people that want to use aviation for a business, right? For their pipeline, for their farm application, whatever it may be, and just can't because certified airplanes are in their own right expensive. So opening up the commercial world to sport aircraft lowers that bar a little bit. Hey, in some cases you can use an airplane that's a little bit cheaper to buy, that's a little bit cheaper to maintain, and that might just make aviation accessible to a wider range of people that otherwise couldn't afford it. Now, my opinion about Mosaic, I don't necessarily think that we'll see a huge shift in how sport pilots use their certificates. Of course, I could be wrong about that. That's pure conjecture, and that's just kind of my personal opinion. And the reason I say that is that one of the main benefits, again, of sport aviation is precisely the cost. That, hey, we can get an light sport aircraft or an experimental aircraft that has not only an initial purchase price, but equally a lower threshold for things like required maintenance, that people are just naturally attracted to these worlds, these aspects of aviation, as an affordable way to get in the air. Now, of course, I can be wrong about that. And I do think that even if I am, we could still potentially see some reduction in the prices for everyone else. If we see sport pilots really getting into certified airplanes, and in particular, if we see them getting into ownership, I believe that extra demand could bring down the cost of things such as a 172, a 182, a 152, a Warrior Cherokee, etc. So I think in either case, it is very possible in one way or another that there will be some sort of price benefit of Mosaic coming out. Um, what I do think will happen is I'm sure what we will see is more sport pilots, again, kind of on a one-off case using their expanded privileges. So I can certainly see, for example, hey, we always go on vacation to this one place, and the only flight school has the Skyhawk. Hey, now we can get in the Skyhawk and go flying. Now we can get in the Cherokee and go flying. So, um, there is, regardless, in a non-ownership point of view, I think we will see sport pilots potentially flying certified more, just not owning certified more necessarily. Again, that's all kind of conjecture. I could be wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts about that in the comments. Um, Pilots with higher ratings, those that have retired from the airlines and don't want to keep up a medical, those that are worried about their ability to hold a medical, can now fly a wider range of aircraft that they're more familiar with. You could see commercial or airline transport pilots operating under the sport rules with a 172 or a 182 or a Cherokee. So equally, you have the ability to benefit people that aren't specifically sport pilots but still choose to work under these sport pilot rules. So essentially, to wrap it all up, what Mosaic does is it expands privileges. It expands options more than anything. Um, and we will see how people decide to use their options and their newfound privileges. So, um, I would love to see any and all of you up in the air. As a fence stretcher myself, currently in Warriors, I'm happy to to provide instruction to any or all who need it. I'm excited to see more sport pilots getting into a bigger world. I hope I'm wrong about sport pilots not really using the certified world much, because I would love to, love to see sport pilots using their privileges more. And to be frank, many of my sport applicants have been very good pilots. Some of my best students, some of the best pilots I've trained, and across the board, very engaged, very passionate. So I'm excited for the benefits that you all have and for the new opportunities that you get. And I'm excited to see you all in the sky. So thanks for watching. Keep an eye out for the next video. And I will see you all soon.